She cornered me at the gala between the champagne table and the east wall, and said 3 words: "Stay away from my family." I smiled. I told her about the drawer. Her hands started shaking before I finished the sentence. Before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you the words that came out of her mouth when she realized I knew exactly where that drawer was and exactly what it contained, I need to take you back 2 years. Because what happened at the gala did not begin at the gala. It began with a back staircase and a fake name and a phone call that lasted 2 hours before the sun came up. He called it protecting me. I called it a cage. A golden one, but a cage. My name is the most recognized name in the world. I will not pretend otherwise. I have been famous long enough that the fame has developed its own separate life, its own history, its own gravity, its own body that walks into rooms before I do and lingers in them after I leave. People do not meet me. They encounter the idea of me and occasionally find the person somewhere inside it, if they are paying the right kind of attention. Most people are not. He was different from the first night. But before I tell you about the first night, I need to tell you who I was before it. Not Marilyn the symbol, the woman under the symbol. Because for 2 years, I believed that the most powerful man in the world had found her. I believed he had looked past everything the world saw and chosen the person underneath. I believed I was finally, after all of it, the failures and the loneliness and the years of performing for rooms that never saw me, I believed I was finally known. I wasn't just hidden, I was held. That is what I believed. I was wrong about the second part. I was not wrong about the first. And the difference between those 2 things is the whole story. To understand it, you have to understand something about what fame does to a woman over time. Not the immediate version, the early years, the rush of it, the discovery that rooms respond to your name before you have fully entered them. That part everyone discusses. The long version. What happens to a woman after 10 years of being a symbol? After 12, the specific exhaustion of performing a version of yourself so consistently that you can no longer locate, without deliberate effort, where the performance ends and the person begins. I had 3 failed marriages before the gathering. I say this without the apology the world has always seemed to want from me on the subject. 3 marriages to 3 men who were, each of them, responding to a different version of me, the version the world had constructed, the version that fit into their needs, the version that looked, from the outside, like something that could be possessed. None of them were wrong about what they wanted. They simply wanted something other than what was there, the symbol, not the person who had assembled the symbol and lived inside it and had been paying, for years, the considerable cost of that particular residence. After 3, I had stopped believing that the right container existed, that there was a room in the world where I could be the full version of myself and be wanted for exactly that, not despite it, not in spite of the difficulty of it, but for it. The gathering was private, the kind that exists above the level where cameras are permitted, where the guest list is not published and the location is not disclosed, and everyone present understands that their being there is itself a trust. I had been to these gatherings before. I moved through them the way I had learned to move through everything that was both necessary and potentially dangerous, with full attention, with the specific awareness of someone who has spent 20 years knowing that any room can turn on you if you are not watching it carefully enough. He was already there when I arrived. I knew who he was before anyone introduced us. Everyone in the room knew who he was. He was the kind of man whose presence reorganizes a space, not through behavior, not through anything visible, but through what he carried. The specific gravity of someone who holds the weight of a country and has learned to hold it in a way that looks effortless from across a room. He was standing with 3 other men, and he was not listening to any of them. He was watching me. Not the way men usually watched me. Men usually watched the category, the symbol. The specific combination of features and movement and presence I had spent years assembling, assembled so successfully that it had become its own entity, capable of occupying rooms without me in any real sense. They watched that. They were held by that. He was watching past it. I noticed. I always notice when someone watches past the performance, because it is rare enough to register and specific enough to be alarming. The people who look past the performance are the dangerous ones. Not dangerous in the simple way, dangerous because they require you to be present in ways the performance does not require, and has, in fact, trained you to avoid. I looked at him directly. The kind of look that in my world carries meaning, and is understood to carry meaning by everyone in the room paying attention. He looked back. Neither of us looked away for long enough that the three men he was standing with began looking at each other instead. An aide introduced us 20 minutes later. His hand when he shook mine was warmer than I expected. He said, "My name," not the famous version that gets said in a certain way to communicate awareness of what the name means, just my name, like a word that referred to a specific person standing in front of him. I said, "You weren't listening to those men," he said. "No," I said. "What were you doing?" He said, "I was trying to figure out if you were as interesting as you looked." I said, "And?" He said, "I don't know yet. That's the problem. Before I tell you about the first phone call, before I tell you about the back staircase and the fake name, I need you to understand something about what it means to be the most famous woman in the world and the loneliest. These two things are not opposites. They are the same condition viewed from different angles. The fame generates the loneliness, the way a spotlight generates a shadow necessarily, as a direct consequence of its own nature. The brighter the light, the darker what it leaves behind. I had been famous since I was 22. I was 34 at the gathering. 12 years of the spotlight. 12 years of the shadow it cast behind me. 12 years of walking into rooms full of people who wanted something from me, and none of them were interested in the particular woman doing the walking. I had been married 3 times. I want to say that without apology, which is how I have learned to say all the things that the world wants me to be apologetic about. 3 times. 3 men who wanted Marilyn, and discovered, at different points in the process, that there was also a person, and who found the person more complicated than they had signed up for. The first too young to understand what he was holding. The second too proud to admit he wanted something he could not manage. The third, the most honest of the 3, he wanted the symbol, and he told me so, which was at least a clarity the others had not offered. After 3, I had stopped believing that the right container existed, that there was a room in the world where I could be the full version of myself, and be wanted for exactly that. He called the next morning. I had not slept, not well. The pills the doctor kept giving me for the insomnia sat on the nightstand, and I looked at them and decided against them the way I sometimes did when something was happening that I wanted to stay fully awake for. Even if staying awake meant lying in the dark with my eyes open until the ceiling became an object I had memorized in detail. I had not given him my number. The fact that he had obtained it told me everything I needed to know about his intentions and his capabilities. He had wanted to call me enough to move the considerable machinery available to him to make the call possible. That machinery was very large and very effective, and moved without friction. I answered. He said, "I figured out the answer." I said, "What answer?" He said, "You are. More interesting than you look, by a significant margin." I said, "You figured that out from 20 minutes at a party." He said, "I figured it out from the way you said, and nobody actually asks that question. They perform asking it. You actually wanted to know." I said, "I did want to know." He said, "I know, that's what told me." We talked for 2 hours, not about anything that could be described simply. The way 2 people talk when they have both spent a long time in rooms where real conversation is not possible, and have found, unexpectedly, someone with whom it is. The relief of that. The specific quality of a conversation that does not require the performance of conversation. I was aware, underneath the relief, that the call was not entirely private. I had been told by someone I trusted that certain phones were certain things in ways that ordinary people did not think about. I had decided not to let that awareness change what I said. If the only way to have a true conversation was to have it knowing it might be heard, I would have the true conversation. The alternative was a managed one, and I had been having managed conversations for 12 years, and I was done with them. But there was something I did not understand yet about what that 2-hour call had started. Something that would not become clear until I was standing between the champagne table and the east wall 2 years later, watching her hands shake. I did not understand, yet, that he was already deciding what I would be allowed to be. At the end of 2 hours, he said, "I want to see you." I said, "That's complicated." He said, "Everything worth doing is complicated." I said, "This is a specific kind of complicated." He said, "I know exactly what kind. I'm asking anyway." He said it the way he said all true things directly, without softening, with the specific confidence of a man who makes decisions in rooms where equivocation costs more than honesty. He was honest. That was the thing about him I was not prepared for and could not stop returning to. He was honest in the way power usually prevents. He had found, somehow, the ability to remain honest even inside everything that surrounded him. I said yes. The first meeting was arranged through channels that left no trace. I was told not to ask about, and did not ask about, a location that belonged officially to someone else, a time that appeared in no calendar that could be accessed. I was given a name, not my name, a simple name, the kind that moves through the world without generating any reaction, and told to use it at the door. I stood outside the door for a moment before I knocked, plain clothes, my hair different. My face constructed differently than usual, not for invisibility, because my face was not going to become invisible, but for a different kind of visibility. The version that says, "I am a woman at a door," rather than "I am the category everyone recognizes. I knocked. He opened the door himself. No aid, no security visible, just him, in a shirt without a tie, looking like a man who had been waiting and was relieved the wait was over. He said, "You came." I said I would. He said, "People say things." I said, "I know." I said it anyway. He stepped aside and I walked into the room and the door closed behind me, and for the first time in more years than I could easily count, I was in a room where I was simply a person. I need to tell you about the first months before I tell you about the moment the cage became visible. Before I tell you about the Gala and the drawer and her hands and the sentence I am going to give you before this is over. He was present. That is the word I keep returning to. In a world where powerful men are present in rooms the way weather is present, filling the space, defining the conditions, but not actually there in any human sense, he was actually present. He listened to what I said. He asked questions that showed he had retained what I told him the previous time. He remembered. He came back to things I had said in earlier conversations and built on them, treated what I told him as material worth retaining and developing, not as conversation to be filled and replaced. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. I had been the most visible woman in my industry for over a decade, and I could count on one hand the number of people who had listened to me the way he listened. He told me things too, not the managed version of himself, the actual things, the fears, the specific cost of being what he was to an entire country, the particular loneliness of a responsibility that could not be shared fully with anyone, because sharing it fully would require making someone else carry it, and he had decided that was not something he was willing to do. I said once, "You carry it alone." He said, "I try." I said, "That must be exhausting." He said, "It is. That's why I call you." I said, "Because with me, you're not carrying it." He said, "Because with you, it's the only time I put it down completely." He said, "You don't need anything from the weight, you just want the person under it." I said, "I do." He said, "Do you know how rare that is?" I said, "Better than most." He said, "Yes, I know you do." He proved it one evening when he called and said, before I had spoken anything more than hello, "Last week you said the camera finds things you don't intend to give it. I've been thinking about that." He said, "I think that's what great work is, the thing that gets through that you didn't plan to send." I said, "What made you think of it again?" He said, "I was in a meeting this morning trying to figure out how to say the true thing inside the official version." He said, "I thought about what you said. I thought she does that every time. She says the true thing inside the performance." He said, "You know exactly what you're doing, and you do it anyway. Do you know how rare that is?" I said, "You keep asking me that." He said, because the answer keeps being the same. They thought I was just the beautiful secret he was keeping. They had no idea the keeping was mutual. No idea that what I was giving him, the real conversation, the room where the performance was not required, was something he could not get anywhere else at any price. No idea that by the 3rd month, I had become the person he thought about when he was not with me. The back staircases became familiar. I learned them the way I had learned every other terrain my life required me to navigate, without being seen with the specific attention of someone for whom observation has always had consequences. Service entrances, side doors, the protocol of locations arranged by people whose job was to make impossible things possible and leave no record. There were men I passed in corridors who did not look at me, and whose job was to not look at me. I began recognizing them the way you recognize furniture in a room you visit regularly. The architecture of concealment has its own personnel, its own hierarchy, its own silent professionalism. The fake name became easy. I used it with the ease of someone who has spent a lifetime performing versions of herself and finds one more version unremarkable. What I was not prepared for was the cage. Not immediately. The cage revealed itself the way walls reveal themselves when you stop moving toward the door, when you realize you have been inside longer than you thought, and the door has, at some point you cannot precisely identify, stopped being the kind that opens from the inside. The first moment I understood was at a public event, a large one, unavoidable, the kind of gathering where my absence would be as notable as my presence, and both would generate the wrong attention. He was there. Of course he was there. He was always at the events that mattered, because he was the primary reason they mattered. I arrived. I moved through the room the way I had learned to performance fully operational, the Marilyn fully present, the category doing its work of being recognized and generating the specific kind of attention that famous things generate. I could feel him across the room without looking. I did not look. This was the new thing. The thing that had not been required before the back staircases and the fake name, the thing that had been installed somewhere in the months of invisible meetings. I did not look, because looking carried a risk that did not exist for anyone else in the room, and I understood this so completely that the not looking had become automatic, not a choice, a reflex. This is the first moment I understood that something had been built around me that I had not been consulted about. I wasn't just careful, I had been trained. And I had trained myself. 3 weeks after that event, a journalist found me at lunch, not the kind who published things, the kind who collected them, who moved through the upper levels of my world gathering information the way certain people gather objects, not for use but for the power of possession. She said, "You've been very quiet lately." I said, "I'm always quiet. You just don't always notice." She said, "I notice everything." She smiled. She said, "I noticed who wasn't looking at who at the Whitmore event." I said nothing. I performed the performance of a woman who had not understood the implication. She said, "Must be difficult, being that invisible in a room full of cameras." I said, "I have no idea what you mean." She said, "No, of course not." She moved away, and I stood in the room with what she had said and understood something I had been approaching without fully reaching. The invisibility was not invisible. It was a performance of invisibility. And like all performances, it was visible to anyone watching closely enough, not as the thing being hidden, but as the hiding itself. This is a different kind of exposure. The hiding is exposed even when the hidden thing is not. I called him that night. I said, "Someone noticed the not looking." He said, "Who?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "We'll manage it." I said, "That is a word you use a great deal. Manage." He said, "It's my primary professional activity." I said, "I know. I'm asking what it means when it refers to me." He said, "It means the situation is contained." I said, "The situation." He said, "I know how that sounds." I said, "Do you?" He said, "Yes." He said it with the honesty I had come to rely on. He said, "You are not a situation. What you are is a person I care about who exists inside a situation. The situation requires management." "You do not." I said, and the difference matters. He said, the difference is everything. I held that. The difference is everything. I knew the distinction was real. I also knew he was managing the circumstance, and we both knew it. But there was something he told me that night that I had not expected, something that changed the weight of everything I had understood up to that point. He said, "The world is going to construct a story about you. The story will be the wrong story. I cannot prevent that, but I can tell you what the true story is while I still have the chance to say it clearly." I said, "Then say it." He said, "The true story is that you are the only person I have met in this position who makes me feel like a person, not a symbol, not an office, a person." He said, "That is what you are to me." I did not know, at the time, that this sentence would become the most powerful thing I possessed. The back staircases became more elaborate. The protocol tightened. The fake name was used more consistently. There were periods of weeks where the calls came less frequently, not coldly, not with distance, but with the careful reduction of someone for whom the pressure has increased, and every point of contact has become a calculation. During those periods I worked. The work was the container for everything that could not go anywhere else. I threw myself into it with the specific intensity of a person who understands that work is the one room in her life where everything is permitted, the full range of feeling, the complete honesty, the version of herself that exists before and underneath the performance. The camera found things in me during those years that I had not planned to give it. I watched the footage sometimes and did not entirely recognize the woman on the screen. I kept my appointments. The doctor on Wilshire, who was careful and asked few questions I did not want asked. The vitamins in the morning and the other things in the evening, which had their own place in the shape of a week. He called them vitamins, and I called them vitamins, and we both understood they were other things as well. But there is a courtesy in the word, and the courtesy was worth preserving. I did not examine them too closely. Thinking too closely about them required an attention I was saving for other things. He saw one of the films during this period. He told me afterward, not immediately, weeks later, in a call. He said, "I saw it." I said, "And?" He said, "There is a scene, in the middle, a few minutes before the confrontation in the hallway." He said, "I watched you in that scene, and I thought he stopped. Then, I thought, that is the person I talk to at 2 a.m. That is the person under everything." I said, "The camera finds things I don't always intend to show." He said, "I know. That's why it's extraordinary." He said, "Most people performing for a camera close themselves down. You open." He said, "You let the thing in. Do you know how rare that is?" I said, "I know exactly how rare it is." He said, "Yes, I know you do." I was not just the woman in the back staircase and the fake name. I was the woman who had made him stop in the middle of his day and think about what she had said. The woman he called back to, not because the connection was still running, but because there was more to say and he needed to say it to me specifically. There was also the other awareness, the one from the first long call, the weight in the silence between sentences on certain nights, the quality of the line that told me someone else might be listening. I never mentioned it. He never mentioned it. We both understood what it meant and had both decided, separately and without discussion, that naming it would cost us something we were not willing to pay. I was not just a woman in love with a man she could not have publicly. I was a woman whose conversations were being filed somewhere by people who had decided that love between us was a matter of national concern. I kept that knowledge in the place. I kept the not looking, underneath everything, not permitted to interfere with what mattered. He told me about the drawer 6 months into the first year. We were in one of the arranged locations, one of the rooms that officially had no record of our presence in it, and he was talking about the weight, the decisions that existed at a level where no one else could fully grasp them. He said, "There are things I cannot tell anyone, not even the people closest to the decisions. Some things are only mine to hold." I said, "What do you do with those things?" He said, "I write them down." I said, "Where?" He said, "Somewhere safe." He paused. He said, "There's a drawer. In the office. You would not find it if you didn't know it was there. Nobody knows it's there. He looked at me. He said, "Now you know." I said, "Why are you telling me?" He said, "Because you are the only person I trust with the things I cannot tell anyone." He said, "If I tell you where the record is, then even if something happens to me, something true exists somewhere that has not been managed or erased or rewritten for convenience." I said, "You think something might happen?" He said, "I think things happen. I think records matter." He said, "I think you are the person I trust most in the world right now," which is a strange thing to say and also completely true. I did not understand, at the time, that the drawer would become a weapon, not one I chose, not one I planned. But information that exists in the world does not remain neutral. It waits. It accumulates significance. And on the right night, in the right room, in front of the right person, it becomes the most powerful thing you have ever said. But there was something else he did not know about, something I had never told him about, something he would not know existed until the night at the gala, when it was already too late for it to matter. The photographs. The photographs were not my idea. I want to say that clearly because the narrative constructed afterward from the outside, by people who were not inside the situation, implied something about the photographs that was not accurate. I did not take them as leverage. I did not arrange for them to be taken. I did not keep them as strategy or calculation. I kept them because they were true. That is the only reason. Because they documented something that existed, real moments, real rooms, two real people, and I had spent too much of my life watching real things be erased and reconstructed into more convenient versions. I was not willing to participate in my own erasure. He knew about the photographs. He had seen some of them. He knew where I kept them. This is what I mean when I say the golden cage was not entirely a cage. Inside it were also these things, the truth of what we were to each other, the specific quality of being known. The drawer and the photographs and 2 years of conversations at hours when the rest of the world was asleep and the performance could finally be set down. Both things were real. The cage was real. What was inside it was real, simultaneously. That is what people in simple situations do not understand about complicated ones. The complexity is not a failure of clarity. It is the accurate description of the thing. They thought the photographs were a risk. They had no idea the photographs were the only honest record that would survive everything that came after. The gala was announced 3 months before it happened. I knew I would be there. My name was on the guest list before I was asked, which was itself a statement about certain assumptions regarding my attendance that I chose not to examine too closely. I knew he would be there. I knew she would be there. What I did not know was that she knew about me. Before I tell you how I found out she knew, before I tell you the moment between the champagne table and the east wall, I need to tell you about the week before the gala. He called on a Wednesday, later than usual, past midnight, which was not unusual, but with a quality in his voice that was. He was not the composed man of the managed calls, or even the honest man of the late-night calls. He was something underneath both of those. He was a man who had been sitting with something he did not know how to say, and had finally picked up the phone because sitting with it alone had become worse. I said, "What happened?" He said, "She asked me a question today." I said, "What question?" He said, "She asked me if there was something I wanted to tell her." I said nothing. I waited. He said, "I said no." I said, "And?" He said, "She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, 'All right,' and walked out of the room." I said, "What do you think she knows?" He said, "I don't know." He said it with the specific quality of a man who does know and is not ready to say it. I had been learning his languages for 2 years. I recognized it immediately. I said, "You do know." A long silence. Then, "I think she knows enough. She is too intelligent not to know enough. She has always been too intelligent. I have been relying on a courtesy she has been extending." He paused. He said, "I think the courtesy may be ending." I said, "Are you warning me?" He said, "I'm telling you what I know. What you do with it is your choice." I said, "What would you like me to do with it?" He said, "I would like you to be careful at the gala." I said, "I'm always careful." He said, "More careful than careful." I said, "And if she approaches me?" He was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than the question required. Then he said, "She won't." He was wrong about that. I spent 3 hours getting ready the night of the gala. Not the usual preparation. The usual preparation had its own long ritual, but this was longer, more deliberate, more weighted with the awareness of what the evening contained. The dress was white satin, the kind of fabric that does not allow you to hide behind anything. The platinum hair the way it always was, slightly tousled, slightly warm. The face assembled with the specific care of a woman who understands that her appearance in certain rooms is a political act whether she intends it or not. I stood in front of the mirror in the finished version and looked at myself for a long time. I thought about the cage, about 2 years inside it, about the back staircases and the fake name and the drawer and the photographs and the calls at 2 in the morning. I thought about what he had said on Wednesday. She won't. I thought, he is wrong. I arrived. The room reorganized itself around my entrance, the way rooms always did, the specific gravitational shift of a famous thing entering a space. I performed the performance. I spoke to the people who required speaking to. I moved through the champagne and the diplomatic choreography of a room full of people who are all performing simultaneously and all know it and none of them acknowledge it. He was across the room. I did not look. She was beside him. I did not look. 2 years of the not looking had made it a reflex. But there is a difference between not looking because you have decided not to, and not looking because the thing you are not looking at has become a presence so powerful that the not looking requires active effort. That night it required active effort, every minute of it. I was speaking to a senator's wife about something I have no memory of when I felt it. The specific quality of being watched by someone who is not watching the category. Someone whose attention has a target and an intention behind it. I turned slightly. She was looking at me from across the room. Not the public look, not the warm, composed, curated expression of a woman who is always being observed and has made that observation part of her performance. She was looking at me with something that had slipped past the performance, something that lived underneath it and had risen to the surface where anyone watching closely could see it. I was watching closely. She began moving toward me. I want to tell you what those seconds felt like. The seconds between her beginning to move and her arrival. Because those seconds contained everything I had been accumulating for 2 years about who I was in this situation, what I was willing to be, and what I was not willing to pretend anymore. The golden cage had been built on pretending. Pretending we did not know each other in public rooms. Pretending the back staircases were simply a route, and not an architecture of concealment. Pretending the fake name was just a name and not a statement about my worth relative to the risk of my existence. In those seconds, moving toward me across the room, was the woman who was the reason for the pretending. Not the cause of our situation, I do not assign her the cause. The structure, the specific human fact that required everything to remain invisible. In those seconds, something decided in me without my choosing it. I was done pretending. Not as a declaration, not as strategy, as a simple, quiet, complete recognition. The cage was not going to open. What we were had always been what it was. And I was no longer willing to perform for the benefit of a room full of people who did not know what was happening, a smallness I did not feel. She reached me between the champagne table and the east wall. The senator's wife found a reason to be somewhere else. We were alone in the middle of a room full of people. She was smaller than I had constructed her from a distance. Not physically, something else. The specific deflation that happens when you finally encounter the thing you have been magnifying through apprehension and find it human-sized. She was a woman, a very controlled, very intelligent, very tired woman. The tiredness lived in her eyes, the control lived in everything else. She said, "I think we should speak plainly." I said, "I agree." She said, "Stay away from my family." 3 words and a subject. The full request, stated without drama, with the efficiency of a woman who has been composing this sentence in private long enough that it has been refined to its essential elements. I looked at her steadily, not with hostility, not with guilt, with the specific steadiness of a person who has looked at the true shape of her situation and made her peace with it and is no longer afraid of it. I said, "I'd like to tell you something first." She said, "I am not interested in anything you have to say." I said, "I think you will be." Something shifted in her face, a tightening, the expression of a person who is prepared for one version of this conversation and is realizing a different version is occurring. I said, "There is a drawer, in the office, left side, below the third shelf, behind the panel that looks like the wall." She went very still. The room continued around us. Glasses, voices, the ambient sound of a large event proceeding at full volume, entirely unaware of what was happening between the champagne table and the east wall. I said, "I know what's in it, not everything. Enough. He told me 6 months ago. He said I was the only person he trusted with the things he could not tell anyone." I let that sit for a moment. "Then, I also have photographs. Not the ones your people took. Different ones. The ones he gave me himself. Because he wanted me to have them. Because there was a version of what we were that he wanted to exist somewhere, in a form that could not be managed or erased." Her hands started shaking. I watched it happen. And I felt nothing simple. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Something that was more like the specific weight of a moment that has been building for a long time and has finally arrived and is exactly as large as you knew it would be. She said, "You're lying." Her voice had dropped below the public register. It was not for the room anymore. I said, "I'm not. You knew the moment I said draw." She was quiet. The shaking in her hands was visible. She was not performing composure anymore. What was underneath it was a woman who had suspected and confirmed, and was now in the physical experience of having the confirmation be real. She said, "How long?" I said, 2 years. She was quiet longer. Then, in a voice that had gone very low and acquired the texture of someone saying something they have been carrying too long, "You think you know what you are to him." I said, "I know exactly what I am to him," she said. "You don't. He told me. He said the only reason he keeps you is because you." She stopped. A man from his staff was approaching, moving with the purposeful ease of a person who has been sent to interrupt something and is executing the interruption with as little visible urgency as possible. She looked at me one more time. The look of someone who has started a sentence they cannot finish, in a room they cannot control, in a conversation that has gone somewhere they had not planned for. In the look was the rest of the sentence, the end she had been about to say and had not said, and that I would sit with for 3 days before I understood what it was. The man arrived. He said something quiet to her. She moved away. I stood between the champagne table and the east wall, and I performed the rest of the gala. I smiled. I spoke. I moved through the remainder of the evening with the practiced ease of someone who has been performing in impossible conditions for 20 years and has not once let the performance fail in public. But the sentence was there, the whole drive home, in the apartment afterward, in the specific silence that descends when the performance is finally over and there is no one left to perform for. He said the only reason he keeps you is because you. I did not call him that night. This was a deliberate choice. Not to reach for the phone the way I had reached for it for 2 years, not to let his voice be the thing that resolved the question, not to hand him the power of the answer. I sat with the unfinished sentence. The first day I went to a fitting. I sat while people arranged fabric around me and spoke across me the way people in that world speak across famous people, as if the famous person is a mannequin that occasionally responds. I responded when required. I smiled when required. I performed the performance. But the sentence was there, under everything. He said the only reason he keeps you is because you. The second day I walked, long and without direction, when I needed to think in a way the apartment did not permit. The apartment was too known, too dense with the record of what I was. I walked in the city, underneath the category I could think clearly. He said the only reason he keeps you is because you are what? Useful, easy, convenient, a relief from something harder, the flattering version. Something he needed that he could only find in me. The diminishing version, an escape, a simplification, something that existed to serve a function in his life and nothing more. I thought about the drawer, the photographs, 2 years of back staircases and the fake name and calls at 2 a.m. when the voice on the other end spoke to me in a way no other voice had managed in 12 years. I thought, the sentence does not end with something small. The sentence ends where the truth ends, and the truth of what I was to him had never been small. On the second day, I also thought about the photographs. I had not thought about them directly in months. They were simply something I possessed, something that existed in the place I kept them, something I had stopped needing to think about because they were not going anywhere, and neither was what they contained. Now I thought about them, about why I had taken them in the first place. Not the practical reason, not the vague instinct towards self-protection that people in impossible situations sometimes develop without naming it. The real reason, which was that I had been living a life for 2 years that existed only in private, that had no public record, that could be, by the people with the power to do it, simply denied, erased, reconstructed as something it was not, or reduced to something smaller than it was, or dissolved entirely into the official version of events from which it had always been absent. The photograph said, this existed. These 2 people were in this room together. This was real. I had not understood, until the second day of sitting with the unfinished sentence, that the photographs were not protection. They were proof. Not of the kind that could be used against anyone. Proof of the kind you keep for yourself. Proof that the thing was real, that you were not making it up. That the years you gave to the back staircases, and the fake name, and the not looking, were given to something genuine, not to a story someone told you about yourself that turned out to be constructed for their convenience. I had the proof. She had walked up to me at the gala and tried to use the true sentence as a weapon, and the sentence had refused to be a weapon because the person it described had the photographs and the drawer and 2 years of calls at 2 a.m. and did not need protecting from the truth of what she was. On the third day I called him. He answered immediately, which told me he had been waiting, which told me he knew what she had said, at least the beginning of it, which meant the sentence had existed before the gala, had been spoken by him to her in some private conversation I was not in, which meant I was in possession of the beginning of a sentence about myself that had been said by the person it concerned to the person most opposed to its existence. I said, she spoke to me at the gala. He said, I know. I said, she started to tell me something you told her, about why you keep me. Silence. The particular silence of a man who has been expecting this moment for 3 days. I said, she didn't finish. He said, no. I said, finish it. A long pause, the longest in 2 years of conversations. The specific length of a pause that contains a decision being made in real time, not whether to tell me. He had already made that decision before I called. The decision about how to say a true thing that has lived in private and is now required to exist in language between 2 people. He said, she asked me once why I was willing to take the risk of you, of what we are, of all of it. He paused. Then I told her the truth. I said, what truth? He said, that you are the only person in my life who has never asked me for anything from the position, who wanted he stopped, then who wanted only whatever I was underneath it. He said, I told her, the only reason I keep you is because you are the only person who makes me remember who I am without all of it, not the office, not the power, not the history I am supposed to be making. He said, with you, the person exists. The person existed before all of this, and exists inside all of this, even when I cannot find him anywhere else. He said, you are the only one who finds him. I said nothing for a long time. He said, That is what she was going to tell you. That is what I told her. I said, "Why did you tell her that?" He said, "Because she asked, and because it was true, and because I have spent my entire life being managed, and I did not want to manage that particular truth, even to her, even in that conversation." I said, "Even knowing she might use it." He said, "Even knowing." The sentence was complete now. He said, "The only reason he keeps you is because you are the only person who makes me remember who I am." I sat with the complete version. I turned it in every direction. I looked at it from the angle she had intended, the diminishing angle, the one supposed to tell me I was a function, a utility, a memory aid for a man who had too much to carry. I looked at it from the angle of the actual words, which said something entirely different. To be the person who makes someone remember who they are is not a small thing. To be that, for the most powerful man in the world, that is not a utility. That is the most human thing one person can be for another. I said, "She thought the sentence would hurt me." He said, "I imagine so." I said, "It doesn't." He said, "I know. That is the thing about the sentence, the person it describes has no reason to be hurt by it." I said, "What happens now?" He said, "I don't know." He said it with the honesty of the honest things, no performance of certainty, no managed reassurance, just the truth of not knowing in the moment of not knowing it. I said, "Yes, you do." A silence. Then, "Yes, I suppose I do." I said, "Then say it." He said, "The Gala made visible things that needed to remain invisible to keep working." He said, "I can manage some things. I cannot manage her. I have never tried to manage her. This is why. Because she is a person, not a situation." He said, "The way this works is the way it has always worked, which is that at a certain point," I said, "the cage closes." He said, "Yes." I said, "Was it ever going to open?" A long pause, the honest kind, the kind that does not arrive at a comfortable answer, because there is no comfortable answer, and he was not willing to offer an uncomfortable one dressed as comfortable. He said, "No, I think we both knew that." I said, "I knew it." He said, "I know you knew it. I think that is part of why I could be honest inside it. You never asked for the door to open. You lived in the space we had." I said, "I did." He said, "It was real. The space was real. I need you to know that." I said, "I know it was real." He said, "I'm sorry it had to be the kind of real that cannot be anything else." I said, "Don't be. Real is rare. I will take rare over ordinary any day." He was quiet. Then, quietly, "Yes, so will I." That was the last night I called him. Not because I was told not to. Not because the cage had a new rule, but because I understood, after that call, that what had been true between us had been said now, fully, completely, and that some true things are complete in themselves and do not require addition. I went back to work. I kept my appointments. I took the vitamins in the morning and the other things at night. I saw the doctor on Wilshire, who asked few questions and whose discretion I trusted entirely. I moved through the shape of my days with the practiced ease of someone who has learned that days do not stop for the weight they contain. The camera found things during that period that I recognized as coming from the 2 years, not from the loss, from the fullness, from having been known in a way that does not erase itself just because it is over. There is a difference between a performance that comes from emptiness and a performance that comes from having been genuinely full. The camera knows the difference even when the audience cannot see it. I knew the difference. I wasn't just a famous woman who had loved a man she could not have. I was a woman who had been found, truly found, by the one person in the world whose position gave him every reason not to look, and who had been given, in the complete version of a sentence meant to break her, the most honest description of what she was to him that could exist. I thought about her sometimes, not with hostility, with the complicated respect one woman can have for another, who was inside something enormous and handled it with more dignity than the situation made easy. She had come to a public room and said, "Stay away from my family," and she had started a sentence she intended to use as a weapon. The sentence had turned out to be evidence of something true. I do not think she knew that when she started it. I think she found out at the same moment I did, when the words were already in the air, and their full shape became clear to both of us simultaneously. It is late now, past midnight, which is when I do my clearest thinking, or what passes for it in these hours. The pills on the nightstand, the half-empty glass. The telephone on the table beside the bed with its cord coiled like something patient. I have been looking at the telephone for an hour. Not waiting, exactly. Waiting is too simple a word for what happens in the silence between his calls, when the silence gets this long and this heavy. It is more like an orientation, the way a compass points toward north without being asked. I am oriented toward the phone. He said he would call when things settled. He says things like that, and he means them. He is not a man who says things he does not mean. That is one of the things I learned early and have not revised. When he says he will call, he calls. The question is not whether, the question is when. I look at the phone, and I think about the Gala, about her hands shaking, about the sentence, and the drawer, and the photographs, and 2 years of back staircases, and the fake name, and the calls at 2 a.m, and the specific quality of being known in the dark by the most powerful man in the world. I think about what it means to love someone who cannot love you publicly. People ask that, not me directly, but in the version of the story that circulates without my participation. They ask it with the assumption that the answer is obvious, painful. The story of a woman who wanted more than she got. They have the question wrong. It is not what it is like to love someone who cannot love you publicly. It is what it is like to be loved in private by someone whose public life leaves no room for it. Those are different questions, and they have different answers. The public version of the answer is the diminishing one. The private version, the version that lived inside those calls and those rooms, was not diminishing at all. It was the fullest version of being loved that I have experienced. Full because it was honest. Full because it existed in the space where performance was not possible. Full because the man doing the loving had told the person closest to him. In a moment he chose honesty over management. The true reason. I was the room he knew how to find. The room that did not appear on any map anyone else could read. For 2 years I was that room. The cage is still golden. The walls are still there. But somewhere inside it, in the space between waiting and his voice, there is the only kind of freedom I have ever fully understood. The phone hasn't rung yet. I'm not done waiting. And I have learned, in the years of famous loneliness and golden cages, that the women who survive are not the ones who stop loving the impossible thing. They are the ones who learn to hold it without being destroyed by it. Who carry the truth of what they were, not the story the world tells, but the true story. The one kept in drawers and photographs and complete sentences and go on. The phone will ring or it will not. Either way, I know now what I am to him. I know it in the full version of the sentence she thought would break me. I know it in his voice when he called me by my name at a party and meant the specific person and not the category. I know it in the drawer and the photographs and the 2 years of being the room no map could find. The cage is closed. The sentence is mine. I'm still here. The women who survive the golden cages of the world are not the ones who convince themselves the cage was not a cage. They are the ones who hold both truths without choosing between them. The cage was real. What lived inside it was real. The door never opened. The thing inside it never died. I have been holding both for as long as I can remember now. It does not get lighter, but it gets more familiar. The way you get familiar with a weight you carry so long that it becomes part of the shape of how you move through the world. Not a burden, a fact. She came to me at the Gala with a sentence. The sentence was already mine before she said it. She just did not know that yet. The phone is still quiet. It is later now than when I started telling you this. The city outside has gone to the kind of silence that only happens in the deepest part of the night, when everyone who has somewhere to be is already there, and everyone who has nowhere to be is suspended in the same between space that I have known all my life. I know how this ends. Not tonight. tonight ends with the phone and the waiting and the cord coiled on the nightstand and whatever version of sleep the pills will eventually allow. But the larger ending, the one the world will write about me, I have known for a long time, in the part of myself that does not flinch from things that cannot be changed, that the ending will not be the one I would have written. But I have the sentence. I have the drawer and the photographs and 2 years of being the room no map could find, and the voice at 2 in the morning that said my name like a word that referred to a specific person. The phone will ring. I know it will ring. I am still here.